Hello, everyone. This is it's great to be here with you. I'm really having fun because the topics and the vectors of the presentations are going in different directions. We see everything from the emotions of immersive journalism to the outside-the-box thinking of art, and now we'll be talking to you a little bit about CryEngine and some of the things that we're doing with it. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the technology, but we're all sort of on the same track, exploring this new medium of VR. And like we said, that's been my journey has all been about convergence between different media. I've been doing computer animation and graphics for my entire career, starting with advertising and then in the film industry, and then I was talking about the convergence between film and games, and got a job at Electronic Arts and tried to bring the technology of films into games, and then vice versa. Now we're trying to bring the game technology back into film. And now, in this latest phase of VR, virtual reality seems to be right at the focus. It's like the nexus between all these different media and all this talk of transmedia. So it's really fun to be in the middle of this time when we're getting to explore not only convergence, but also the invention of a whole new media. So I am the creative director for CryEngine. Some people say, well, why do you need a creative director for an engine team? That's software development, isn't it? Well, yes, and in fact, most of my job has to do with management of the team and trying to figure out how to get things done, schedule, agile development. But I think it's important that everything we do is focused and aiming towards what it is you want to do with that technology. What are the creative challenges? What are the problems that you want to solve? So software without a vision for where you want it to go is just software. So I get to manage the CryEngine team, but I also work on how to figure out how we're going to invent the future, what technical problems we need to solve, what tools we need to build so that we can create the most beautiful and fun to play games and experiences that are possible. It's challenging and exciting. And, lately, like a lot of other people, we've turned our attention to virtual reality. Now, I saw the hands go up earlier. Some of you are already starting to develop in virtual reality. You know how daunting a process this can be. Everything seems new. Your old strategies don't fit. It can be a very exciting time, but also very unnerving. So my message is don't get discouraged. After all, we're getting to participate in the birth of a new medium. We've already figured out what it takes, and we've already figured out that it requires a completely different approach than you might have used in traditional games and film. We've solved many of the technical problems. We're not done yet. We're still working on that in the CryEngine team. But now we are starting to come to the fun part for me, which is what do you do with the new medium? What kind of experiences do we want to create? What stories do we want to tell? So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the challenges that get us to the point where we can tell stories using CryEngine, and some of the challenges that we're facing now in creating those kind of immersive experiences. What I'm not going to do today, though, is talk much about the history of VR, how we got here today, how it was invented. Well, I'll give you a 30-second view. How it was invented in the early 50s. During the 90s, it was full of shiny promise, but it was too expensive. And it wasn't until the advent of all the new high-resolution displays and faster GPUs that'll run on mobile devices that's what opened the door to VR. And I'm not also going to talk too much about the spectrum of VR possibilities that are out there. We heard earlier, Simon was talking a little bit about it, the fact that you've got linear 360, then you've got stereoscopic 360 video, then you've got linear 360 stereoscopic video, and then you've also got linear true head tracking VR, and then you've got true VR where you can move in through the world. And it's kind of a wide spectrum, and the distinctions between them can be quite blurred, to say nothing of the fact that we're also moving now beyond these into augmented reality and beyond even that. So I'm not going to talk about the low-level technical challenges. There have been some great presentations at other venues, and you can look it up online, about the constraints and challenges that we need to be able to create immersion and avoid motion sickness. What I am going to do is talk about the things that we have learned about VR at Crytek so far. Some of the technical requirements a little bit, and some of the creative hurdles for creating a great immersive experience. I'm going to share with you the rendering technology that I believe is necessary for immersion in any kind of VR and its relationship, or lack thereof, to photorealism. And I also am going to talk about two projects that we have done and recently completed at Crytek. One, a full interactive VR game, which you can see back here, The Climb, and one, a linear VR experience, using these to illustrate some of our learnings about level design, locomotion, 3D audio, and my favorite part, the narrative design. You know, an interesting thing that I've noticed along the way is how the domain that people come from, what they're working with, what they're most familiar with currently, it tends to separate them into two different camps when it comes to embracing VR for the first time. People who make movies like to evolve into VR from a linear experience perspective. They want to control the storyline and be the director, whereas game makers want to create fully interactive experiences that you explore at your own pace. In both cases, there are questions to be dealt with about the sense of presence in the world versus agency in the world. You know, am I there just to absorb it, or do I have any kind of effect on the world? And there's ranges provided to the user in the sense of agency, from locomotion, can you move through the world, can you only look around? And as you know, CryEngine, of course, is has been around for quite a while. I've got to find my mouse. It's not up there, is it? There it is. There we go. Sorry about that. CryEngine's a powerful tool set for creating interactive experiences in games, and our legacy, of course, is in realistic, high-resolution, first-person games. And we've been doing stereoscopic 3D for a long time. So it's not any surprise that it's actually a good fit to map the power of CryEngine onto VR. And we've spent the last couple of years turning all of that experience towards VR and making it available to our licensees and our users. So everything I'm going to be talking about today comes from the perspective of CryEngine, and I will use CryEngine and our technology as my example. But I believe that the points I will be making are valid, hopefully, no matter what software you use. If you want to make a real VR experience, you should come to a real engine, though. I'll leave it at that. And I hope you will find something of value in what I have to share. Keep in mind that there's a lot of stuff that we can't cover, so this is just an overview, kind of a slice. So, the promise of virtual reality is to create an experience of a simulated world that feels real. I mean, that seems pretty obvious, right? But it really is a challenge. Before we can get into designing the gameplay or the experience that we want our users to have, we have to take our players across the threshold, get them to suspend their disbelief and become immersed in the world that we've created for them. In the good old days of flat screens, there was always a sense that you were looking through a window, not really part of the virtual world. It takes a mental leap in that state to forget that you're looking at the screen. Today in VR, that separation is gone, or at least that's one of our goals, is to make it be gone, make it disappear. And that involves fooling our senses even more thoroughly than we ever have before. So how do we do that? How do we create a convincing game in VR? And how far have we gotten in that goal so far? This is a screen grab from our new game for Oculus, The Climb. We render scenes like this at 90 frames per second in stereoscopic, so that's twice on the Rift for an effective frame rate of 180 frames per second. The ability to render a believable world at this kind of detail at those frame rates is, I believe, one of the fundamental technical challenges that a game engine must be able to deliver on to give a great VR experience. The Climb features amazing vistas, locations with awe-inspiring sights, and thrilling free rock climbing experience. And we'll have a little bit more on the gameplay aspects of that later. Right now, let's take a look at a teaser for the Climb and get an idea of what it feels like in VR. Of course, you can actually see it on the Rift back there, and as always, video can't really convey the full sense of VR.
Achieved with CryEngine.
So that's an example of what you can do with CryEngine when you have a team of talented artists and designers like we have here in Frankfurt. So what are the basics to make a game like this work in VR? Okay, I lied a little bit. I am going to talk about a little bit of the technical low-level details. There are a few fundamentals that are probably worth reviewing before we get into the details of how to make realistic images like these in VR. The first one is frame rate. It's funny to think that, you know, and I was guilty of this, the people who were making VR in the 90s experimented with displays that ran at like 15 to 20 frames per second, and we thought that was cool. Now we know that 90 frames per second is a requirement. And it's not just for the aesthetics. We're trying to sustain the illusion that you are really there. It's kind of like an update frequency of an AC light. You know, anything less than 60 frames per second and 60 cycles per second, and you can see the flicker, except that in VR, the flicker is much more noticeable because it fills your entire field of view, and moving objects will appear to strobe. And if the frame rate is not perfectly steady, there are a few dropped frames, it's instantly noticeable and can break the sense of presence. We hardly notice a few drop frames in a regular game, but in VR they can be jarring or maybe even make people sick. Secondly, everything that happens in the game has to flow, and the game must respond to input from the player very quickly, i.e. there must be very low latency on the order of 30 milliseconds, or no lag from the input from the controller. Even fast head movements, the camera motion cannot lag behind, or you lose the sense of being there. The third important factor is resolution. This is the interesting one, because when your aim is to blur the distinction between virtual and reality, you don't want your screen to be blurry. But wait, you might say, the current generation of head-mounted displays come nowhere near to the fidelity of the human visual system, and that's true. I mean, we aspire to higher resolution, but we still have a ways to go. So what can we do about that? First of all, it's important that you render at the native resolution of whatever device you're using so that you get the maximum possible resolution to start with. And also, the number of pixels is not actually the only measure of the resolution of a system. There's temporal resolution, how quickly you update, that we talked about a moment ago. There's also the bit depth, that's how many colors you can show, and the visual complexity and lighting. All of these things are actually independent of the actual 1920 by 1080 or 4K resolution. Since the pixel resolution on your display is limited, we can compensate by using very sophisticated lighting to support the illusion of reality. We'll get into that a little bit more later. So, rendering for VR. We already had a very powerful rendering engine in CryEngine years ago, but we knew that it would not be enough for VR. I'm not going to get into too many details here, but what I will tell you is that we've done is completely rewrite it from scratch to make it much more efficient and much faster. And we've also set it up to take advantage of some of the new APIs that are available for the new GPUs, such as DX12 and Vulkan, and we're even thinking about going to iOS Metal. But we knew from experience that even though we could render the quality that we wanted, we weren't going to be able to get the frame rate that we needed to get the immersion. So CryEngine uses an advanced stack of rendering techniques that's capable of reproducing the way the world looks very accurately, and all this fancy refactoring that we've been doing allows us to actually use this technology now, even when we only have 11 milliseconds per frame, which isn't very much time. I mean, when you think about it, a regular game running at 30 frames per second without stereo, that's 30 seconds. 3 times, we have to go 6 times faster. It's relatively easy for simple scenes, but when you want to create a photorealistic world, it's another whole ballgame. A side note here, of course, is that, of course, photorealism is arguably not really necessary for immersion in VR. It's what many of us are interested in, and of course it's absolutely necessary if what you want to create is something like the Matrix or the holodeck, or when you start talking about augmented reality, if you want to lay something over the real world and have your audience believe that it really is part of the real world, then photorealism comes back stronger than ever. But there is a place for cartoon styles, very stylized looks. And the important thing, though, is that it has to be consistent. We have a powerful solids modeling tool called CryDesigner that's perfect for developing stylized looks. What's important is that no matter what type of experience you're creating, you need to create a consistent and believable world. The underlying factor for the consistency is that given the rules for your particular world, the way things look and appear have to fit together coherently. That's what gives it that sense of plausibility. With a powerful rendering stack like what we have in CryEngine, your artists won't have to compromise and can create a world that's as photorealistic or as epically stylized as they want, and it can all fit together. So whatever style you choose, you need to make the material properties and lighting of your world work together. So let's look at how we do this in CryEngine. We'll see how building from the bottom up can create a consistent and a beautiful world. Actually, I'm starting from the top down, but it's a matter of semantics. Physically based rendering, image-based lighting, global illumination, volumetric effects, and advanced particles. These are the components that together allow us to create things like what you see in the climb. Physically based rendering simulates the interaction between light and materials using real-world physics, or at least the best approximation that we can afford right now in real time. We replicate the way light behaves in the real world, and this leads to a more natural and believable results and ensures that the materials look plausible. One benefit of doing this, applying physically based models, is that fewer parameters are required to achieve the same results, leading to more streamlined and approachable content creation workflows, i.e., this is one of the few places where you can get faster, cheaper, and better at the same time. PBR also, when used properly, ensures that various objects made on a wide range of materials not only look real by themselves, but they also appear consistent with each other, like they are all part of the same world. And it's worth noting that we're not limited to photorealism, again, with PBR, because we allow artists to set the parameters for these different materials to values that are outside of what happens in the real world if you want to make things that glow or create surreal or magic effects. It's pretty powerful. I think that's important. So this work was started actually during Crisis and on Rise, Son of Rome in CryEngine, used in-house, and now with the optimizations I've been talking about, physically based rendering is paying off for us in VR. Here's a scene from Rise that shows you the physically based rendering and lighting, image-based lighting, causing these great shadows and metal properties, all part of a unified look. I love the look of that game. Another big advantage of physically based shading is the consistency factor that I was talking about. When an object or a character's material properties are set up properly, they work regardless of the lighting or game scenario that they were originally created for. In other words, they will look the way a real object in the real world would look under that particular lighting condition. This is a huge win for streamlining production costs and reusing assets. We can make props and characters more portable, use them in places where they were never intended. For example, having nano-suits fighting against Roman barbarians. I want that game, actually. That would be fun. Whoops. I think I jumped one too far. So, to do this right, you need global illumination, or GI. Luckily, our engineers have come up with another advanced volumetric technique that can allow global illumination to run in real time. We now have SPARSE VOXEL OCTREE global illumination, which stands for the ability to create bounce lighting. It's a system that runs at runtime. It's very compact. What it does is it actually takes whatever level you build and at runtime automatically creates a voxel-based representation of the whole level, which is very compact. It's kind of weird though, like little volumes that approximate the shape. I won't go into the details of it, but it allows the system to automatically and in real time compute diffuse bounce light. It does this and updates it as things change in the level, so you can also have global illumination that changes dynamically. Here are some images from one of our licensees, Warhorse Studios. They're making a game called Kingdom Come Deliverance, which features these huge worlds where there's trees and forests and rocks and everything. And this was their default lighting with SVOGI just added. You can see just the simple addition of the SVOGI causes the dimensionality to become richer in depth. And of course, interior areas, now you get a bounce light. You may not be able to see it here with the lighting, but it improves shadows and makes things much more realistic, and it's essentially free. And when you have someone who's really familiar with the lighting system in CryEngine, you can use it along with light probes and volumetric fog to create worlds that look incredibly real. And in fact, the atmosphere is an important factor. In the real world, there's atmosphere everywhere. What I mean is that the air is never really perfectly transparent. We judge distance by the amount of haze between us and the mountains, for example. And fog gives things a sense of depth. Even perfectly clear air is not. It affects the light passing through it and can create a slight tint or shade. We introduced voxel-based, again, volumetric fog system in CryEngine 3.8. We've had it for a while. So this supports illumination from deferred lights and works consistently with transparent objects, including particles. So the important thing about this kind of atmosphere in VR is that it's actually 3D. It's not a post-process added on at the end, which was one of the traditional ways to make it fast. That means that as you move through the world, the fog is really surrounding you, and these light beams dimensionally pass through the world. You know, and we'll keep coming back to that. It's the sense of the consistency, the little things that trick your eye into believing that it's really there. We actually extended it recently for CryEngine 5. Now the volumetric fog system supports volumetric clouds that you can fly through in real time. And we'll see that in the linear piece a little later. The last component in the tech stack is particle system. We have a new particle system, and of course these are synonymous with visual effects in games because interactive particles are one of the most efficient ways to simulate a wide range of visual effects, from smoke, fire, sparks, clouds. Sometimes we even use it for water. In CryEngine 5 we introduced a new visual effects system that offloads particle management and processing from the CPU onto the GPU. This is the greatest thing to happen recently in terms of greater power. This allows us to achieve significantly higher numbers of particles, read greater fidelity, higher resolution, and allows us to run more expensive effects. And this, again, is critical in VR when all you have is that measly little 11 milliseconds. This image is an example of a very sophisticated application of the particle system because, we don't use it just for sparks and explosions. These tendrils are ribbon-style particles with their motion being simulated on the GPU. And like the rendering system, the new particle system is a complete rewrite. It's way faster and more efficient than it was before, even when it's running only on the CPU. And when GPU resources are available, it can use them to go even faster. And it also has a very cool node-based editor now that allows you to set up your effects and preview them within our sandbox editor. In the end, I'm going to show you some of these effects done with this on the VRSCORE benchmark using the new particle system. There we used it for smoke and sparks and flames and all kinds of fun stuff. So, now we can render things, right? Let's talk a little bit about level design, player movement, and gameplay for VR. Last year in our Back to Dinosaur Island 2 demo, we discovered how being able to see your own hands in VR helps reinforce a sense of immersion. And like Simon was talking about, there are ways to get around this, and there's some times when it's important, when you want to interact with a sense of place and make it feel like you're actually gripping onto handholds. The mechanics of holding your hands and gripping onto things when all you have is a standard play controller, though, proved to be initially difficult. But we had such success with that Dino demo that our designers continued to work on it, and they improved it and came up with the prototype for the control system that's now used for the Climb game. And it works really well. We produced the whole game for Oculus, and it's been released, and it's doing really well. The Climb team continued to refine this mechanics using the gamepad controller. Of course, we knew that the touch controllers are coming, but we needed to make the game. Actually, it was quite a challenge because the game needs to be the same game whether you're using a gamepad controller or the touch controllers. So the design of the way it works was quite a challenge, but also Oculus did not want us to make a game that requires you to buy yet another piece of hardware beyond the expensive head-mounted display, at least not initially. So the Climb team developed the method using the head tracker for a point where you point where you want your hand to go with your head, and then use the triggers to grip on the left and right side. It sounds awkward at first, but most people pick it up in a few minutes, and it works great. It feels like you really have hands. This shows you how plastic the human brain is at being able to map one set of inputs onto the way you expect the world to be. This ability to climb opened up a whole new playground where our gameplay designers could navigate through the world using their hands and to grab and pull themselves up just like you would in the real world. They experimented with handholds and edges and anchor points and ropes and all kinds of fun stuff. And once they had these basics figured out, they just entered into VR and put themselves into the game. The designers created a vocabulary of different types of handholds and began experimenting with different types of terrain and building routes up them. Matthias Otto was a senior level designer at Crytek, and he said about this, I'm going to quote him here, "From a starting point, what did we think would look cool? When I look up at the rock, what kind of challenge would I like to face? What would be the most exciting and the most interesting thing that I could do?" We continued that kind of testing as we progressed through each level. Constantly testing is it's way more important in VR than in traditional gameplay. So, some of the early VR experiences, people got sick because they were moving in an unconstrained way through the world. And what we realized, it was actually known, but you have to learn it for yourself, is that whenever there's a disconnect between what your eyes are telling you about where you are and how you're moving through the world, and what your inner ear and what your feet and your hands are telling you, if there's a disconnect, that's where the sense of motion sickness can come from. So some of the first games that were successful used the idea of a cockpit or a way of separating you, frame of reference, if you will, something that the player feels attached to. And that's why we see a lot of games now with cockpits and vehicles. They give you a frame of reference that stays with you, and the world is seen as being outside. When you're climbing up a rock face, though, you don't have the benefit of that. You know, a good example of something similar or that's analogous to this in the real world is the way people get motion sickness on a sailboat. If you're down below deck in a pitching sailboat, you've got the reference frame of the room that you expect to be stable, but it's not, it's pitching. And so your ears are saying, whoa, this room is pitching, but it doesn't look like it to my eyes. And the best antidote to that is to go up on the deck, find the horizon, and look at that. Then, in spite of the motion of the deck, you have something that you can use as a reference. That's what we do with the rock wall in the climb. And even though you're free to move, you still are constrained because your hands are always attached to the wall. There's a sense of being oriented to the wall. In fact, in this image here, you can see how the level designers put in what they call body orientation constraints. You feel like you can go anywhere, and you let go with one hand, you can look around, but you always come back to a sense of being attached to the wall. And it's quite intuitive because that's the way it works in the real world. And you're not really unconstrained. They keep you oriented and through these invisible constraint systems throughout. Again, quoting Matthias, actually he wrote a very interesting blog on the design of the levels that you can check out online. He said, "Our rock faces are very detailed and natural looking to maintain the immersion in VR, but we were conscious that we needed players to easily understand where they could climb. To help you choose your path, one of the things we do is leave chalk marks on some of the grips ahead so you can recognize routes. That said, some of our secret routes are really well hidden and not signposted in any way. So the more that people become experienced in the game and the more you explore and look around, the more routes you'll discover, and that's part of the fun." This image shows what goes on behind the scene in one of the levels. There are collision volumes and trigger points for debris, sound effects, orientation constraints, and more, all designed to surround and orient and support the connection of the player to that rock wall. Another important aspect of VR is detail. In VR, especially in a game like The Climb, everything that is near field, i.e. within your hand's reach, has to be very detailed because otherwise it can break the sense of immersion. So when it comes to making the cable cars for The Climb, the team really had to increase the amount of detail for the surface structure far beyond what you might normally imagine, especially in the areas where players are allowed to grab a hold and climb right up the side of it. The cable car is an example how they had to deliver close-up detail. But the team also paid the same level of attention to other elements like the wooden platforms and the zip line that you'll use at some points to traverse huge gaps. It's knowing where to put the detail because you can't detail the whole world at the same fidelity. But the most important part of the close-up scenery in The Climb, of course, is the rock surface in front of you. After all, that's what you're looking at most of the time when you climb. To get the required amount of surface detail, the Climb team used photogrammetry, a technique where you take scans of real rock and transfer these onto virtual models. This process provides a great base to work from as the proportions of the rock formations, even their microstructure, the texture maps, and the bigger shapes are all really accurate. And you can kind of kit bash them together to create a wide range of rock surfaces and even larger and more convincing huge formations. And they all scale and feel authentic. And these are just some couple of vistas from the game. Shows you how well it holds up close and far. So, a great VR experience. It's about rendering, it's about the modeling, it's about the gameplay, but it's not just that. There's also audio, which plays a big role, as we know, of course, in entertainment media in general. And it turns out that arguably it's even more important in VR. And that gets back to the consistency thing again. All the inputs to our senses have to be high fidelity and totally in sync with each other. same thing that applies to your head tracking with the visuals. We've learned that this same principle applies to sound, that it's more complicated than simple stereo panning to match the tracking of your head. In the real world, our ears are able to pinpoint the location of sounds amazingly accurately. The sound in our VR experience is wrong, even by just a little bit, the sense of presence can be broken. This image shows you a scene from the Sky Harbor piece I'm going to be talking about in a minute, and this shows the paths of a bunch of the objects that go flying around in the air during the course of the experience. So how do you deal with making that sound real? Well, as a starting point, we have an amazingly powerful audio system in CryEngine that's synchronized with the animation. And we use 3D mono sound sources that you actually place in the world. If you look closely on the image on the top left there, you'll see little speakers. Each one of those speakers represents a monoscopic audio source, like a wave file, but that you can trigger whenever you want. If we locate them in 3D space around the place where the player is going to be, and then we construct a sound image using pan and fade based on which way you're facing, you can get a pretty good soundscape that surrounds you, that gets louder and softer as you look around. But even this is not enough. This is where one of my favorite features of audio, spatial audio, comes into play. This is where we use the HRTF, which stands for Head-Related Transfer Functions. It's the name for a response that characterizes the way our ears hear sound from a point in space. HRTF. They're associated with spatial or 3D audio, and they mimic how sound is attenuated by our own ears or blocked by our head. You know, you have two ears, and if I turn this way, a sound coming from my left will be louder on the left side, but it'll also be attenuated by my head. So my right ear hears it a little bit later, just a little bit, but it's enough. Your brain can tell it. It's later, and it's blocked by my head, so it's muffled slightly. Our ears are amazingly good at using these subtle cues to determine the location of sounds that we can't even see what's causing them in the real world. I think it probably comes from millions of years of evolution where, you know, the predator was sneaking up behind you, and it was important to be able to tell which way you should jump. When this kind of binaural or spatial audio is done right, in VR, it totally reinforces the sense of immersion, and it'll be great for horror experiences. A pair of HRTF functions for two ears can be used to synthesize a binaural audio sound that seems to come from a particular spot in space. Just like in the movies, though, sometimes the best experience is not exactly the way it is in the real world. You might want to go beyond realism and exaggerate things to make them stronger and more immediate. If a sound coming from behind us is slightly muffled by our outer ear, for example, we can accentuate this more than what would happen in the real world. In VR, it convinces us because it can kind of overemphasize the point that we want to make. As long as you don't go too far, it works really well. These are two graphs for how we can use exaggeration in audio. The one on the left shows three filters, reverb, low pass, and volume. And the horizontal axis is like our head is in the middle, and to the left and to the right, the graph represents 180 degrees in either direction. I mean, we could analyze this in depth, but the gist of it is that the filters are independently modified based on the angle of the sound from your head. So if it's coming from behind, it's muffled. If it's coming from the front, it's louder, and the reverb is affected as well. And our audio engineers are really good at tweaking this. Once it's set up, though, it's automatic. Though on the right, we see a graph that shows dynamic EQ being varied as the direction of the sound source. It's amazing stuff. So that's quite a swath of technology that we've covered there, and we've been sampling some of the technical challenges for VR and how we've been addressing them with CryEngine. Once you have these kinds of technology, and there are more, but this is the important ones, I think. Once you have them right, you can move on to some of the more fun creative work. It's beyond the scope of my presentation here to cover all of the creative challenges and the techniques to solve them. In fact, we're still working on them and having a lot of fun at Crytek. But there is one area that I would like to share with you in a bit of detail, just to show you the kind of kind of effort that goes into solving these problems and what we've come up with. And this comes from the other project that I was telling you about. It's called codename Sky Harbor. And it's featured in the VRSCORE benchmark from a company called Basemark. Basemark is known for creating a series of benchmarks that people download and use to test the power of their computer and compare it to their friends to make sure that you have a better one. VRSCORE is designed to test and rate your computer's ability to run VR. And it will be released publicly next month. And Basemark came to us with a really cool request. They didn't want to just write a bit twiddling piece of software or something that would render a furry donut. They wanted something running inside their VRSCORE benchmark that was a real game level powered by a real game engine. So the quantifiable, yes, but based on something that would be fun to look at and also would be defensible. So we saw this as an opportunity to test and demonstrate the power of our engine in VR. Its ability to render a spectacular and immersive world. You know, all the stuff that I've been working on with the team, all these different technological hurdles, we needed a way to test and exercise that. And it just so happened that powerhouse art director Erasmus Brosdow had a concept for content that fit the bill perfectly. Last year, Erasmus had already made concept sketches, and they were on the walls around his desk for a place that he called Sky Harbor, and I loved it from the moment I first saw it. It's like a world filled with giant flying aircraft carriers, heroic human pilots, brave little maintenance droids living a romantic and dangerous life in the clouds on a mysterious world that holds a dark secret. And they have to battle the evil Crown Patrol forces in order to survive. I mean, this is classic stuff. And so I discussed this with my boss, Chavat, and we realized that it was a perfect world to test our new VR tech and create a linear VR experience for Basemark. Now, the main constraint of a benchmark, as I said, is repeatability. It has to be the same every time it runs so that you get the same results. And they can be compared to what your buddy got on his or her PC. So it could not be a fully interactive, free world game. We also could not assume that users would have input devices. The goal was simply to test mainly the CPU, the GPU, and the head-mounted display. So no hand controllers, unfortunately. So this is not going to be a free, open-world, interactive game. But it rather neatly set to the design space a real-time, rendered, linear VR experience with no interaction. But it needed to be fun, and the best way to do that, I felt, was to tell a story. So that's what we did. I had an awesome opportunity to work with Erasmus, and we co-wrote and directed this little project, and we created codename Sky Harbor. We used it as a test bed, and we had a chance to experiment with some of the problems of the narrative domain at the same time. So, you know, people are talking about the language of cinema. In some ways, we followed the conventional path. We brainstormed ideas, we wrote a backstory based on Erasmus's vision, and then a treatment for the piece we were going to do, and then storyboards. And then, like the Climb team had done, we just jumped in and started experimenting in the VR space in our engine. We had a small team of artists, modelers, level designers, animators, and cinematic directors, as well as the CryEngine technical team who were creating the tools that we were testing for them. And they all enthusiastically jumped on board. We only had about 2.5 months to do this, but I already knew some of the basic problems that I wanted to explore in directing for VR. One such problem, and this is one of the basic ones, and that's why we're going to talk about here, is, and Simon mentioned it too, is how do you direct the audience's attention in VR? In a traditional movie, the director has control of the camera, right? And in fact, the art of how to compose a scene through the lens of the camera has been evolving into the language of cinema for over 100 years. In VR, we're just now starting to invent what everyone thinks, and I agree, will become the VR equivalent of this language. And it's really fun to try to participate in that process. You know, for example, in a movie, you can look wherever you want to on the screen, but the director can make sure that what he or she wants you to look at is at least on the screen, right? In VR, the audience can look anywhere they want to in 360 degrees. If you take away control of the camera, they instantly get sick. This is an excerpt from the treatment for Sky Harbor. We deliberately designed a scene where the viewer would need to turn their head to see the unfolding action. In this section, maintenance droid number 21 has been trying to free us from the wreckage of our crashed little ship on the deck of the Sky Harbor when suddenly an enemy fighter sweeps in from the left. You probably already read that while I was talking so much. On to the storyboard. We were already somewhat familiar with the 360-degree field of view challenges. I've worked in that space since SSX and even Battlefield. We had 360 video, but that's not the same as VR. At this point, we realized that our traditional storyboarding techniques were not up to the task of conveying the viewer's experience and illustrating how to set up the scene. So we invented a simple new format, the VR storyboard. Other people have come up with similar ideas now. It's amazing how much it helps. In our case, Erasmus laid it out so we had two panels side by side in each frame. On the right is the standard view, a high aspect ratio to convey kind of the fact that you can see a pretty wide field of view if you move your head just a little bit. On the left is what we call the radar view. This shows a top-down view of what the viewer can see all around them, the full 360 degrees. What we're seeing here is a top-down view of where we are trapped on the deck of a Sky Harbor. That's the Sky Harbor on the left there, seen from above. The faint inner circle that you can barely see, I don't know if you can even see it, there's a faint inner circle. This shows the zone where the stereoscopic parallax is predominant and you feel like you can reach out and interact with objects. So this is an important thing to establish when you're creating your scene. The outer edge of the circle is where the stereoscopic effect becomes negligible, and beyond that things could just as well be rendered in mono. The pie-shaped slice that's kind of going up to the top, that indicates the horizontal field of view as seen from the right-hand view of the scene. And it also indicates the direction that we expect the audience to be looking. It also shows what's happening around the viewer, even in directions that we are not expecting them or want them to look. So here we see number 21 pointing to the approaching crown carrier and saying, "Oh no, we're doomed." Assuming the viewer takes the cue, the next frame of the storyboard, they'll spin their head around, look, and we show that in the storyboard. Like in a conventional game, the storyboard becomes the blueprint for the level designer to set up the sequence. This frame shows the desired viewer direction resulting with the attacking ship hovering behind us to our right. Now, we worked with the cinematic designers using these storyboards as a template for building the sequence in the engine, and this is what it initially looked like. And so here we see number 21 pointing over there, and oh no, he's actually pulled our leg off and he uses it to try to defend us. Typically we would try something and review it on the HMD and then try it again. Our design evolved slowly and we experimented. We came up with like 5 main stimuli, at least in the context of our story, for this desired turn and look behavior. Number 21, who has been looking at us, he suddenly stops and turns his gaze to the right. And then he points with his hand. And then he says, "Crown Patrol, we're done for." The approaching aircraft meanwhile makes a strongly directional sound. You know, the 3D audio, and it gets louder coming from that side. And if the guy still hasn't looked by that time, we have a laser tracking system that shines from the ship onto us as if he was trying to draw a bead on us. And even if you're not looking in the right direction, you see these lasers and it makes you want to turn your head. These techniques work really well if the viewer is interested in the story and not totally distracted by something else. And you have to leave time at the beginning of the experience for people to look at things. I'm guilty of that myself. I want to see whether the ripples in the water look real, you know, or used to drive my son nuts when I played Halo with him because I was always shooting into the water. But there are, of course, lots of iterations, left to right, timing, audio, tweaks, and all that, working in the headset. But here's what it looks like in the final piece, hopefully. Maybe. Come on.
Sorry. And you're still stuck. Ground Patrol, we're done for.
So that's just one little piece from like the 5-minute thing. Another good example for directing the audience attention is when number 21 comes back after this, and we're still stuck there, and he goes, "Oh, Scrap, you're still stuck. Let's see if we can try to get you loose." And at this point, he's right in your face, and he's like pulling on the wreckage that's across your chest, and he hears a noise, and there's flashes, and he looks to see what's causing it, and he delivers his, "I'm just a poor maintenance droid" speech. I don't know what to do. But it's an example of the same kind of technique. And, you know.
Yeah, all right. Oh, Scrap, let me try to pull you loose again. Now what? Rust and rain. What are we gonna do? The main turret is offline. The Crown carrier's coming down. I'm just a maintenance droid. All I know is how to fix things. I can fix this. You wait here. Oh, right. Never mind.
So, actually I want to say one other thing there. These are just two examples of the kind of simple directorial challenges that we face in VR. And this is, again, just one slice of that spectrum of the different types of experiences. And I love the idea of having guided linear movie-like experiences, but I also love the idea of open world, and I also like Simon's ideas for completely turning everything on its head and, you know, letting people discover threads of the story that unravel and extend beyond the range of whatever you set them up for. And scenes like these might, well, in my opinion, they feel natural to us today. We're really proud of them. But as effective as they are, I also suspect that in the future they're going to seem contrived in the way that some of those early scenes of people on the stage look to us today as we develop a new language of subtle VR direction cues. But, you know, it's really fun to work these things out. And for me, that's the most fun space, when you have all this new technology and you're trying to figure out how to apply it to solving a creative challenge. And, you know, as we develop this vocabulary, we're going to be taking on increasingly complicated and subtle scenarios. So, wrapping it up for today, you do need to have a powerful engine that places you in the action before any of these things we've been talking about even are relevant. And the engine you choose is only one piece of the puzzle, but getting this foundation right is extremely important now, especially in what I like to call the Wild West phase of VR, when everything is new and we're still inventing the language of VR. But if your engine and your tools cross that technical threshold that we've been talking about, then you have your bases covered and you can focus on the creative problem solving and hopefully have some fun along the way. You know, Sky Harbor itself is an example of the kind of story that fits really well into this paradigm. In this case, it was a linear VR experience that sets up the premise, but it could easily grow into a full-fledged open-world VR game. I want to fly those ships and go, you know, exploring the rest of the world, or become a blockbuster movie, or maybe both, or even beyond that. With tools like Film Engine, which we're not even getting into here today, and with CryEngine, we may have an opportunity to explore possibilities like this. And the coolest thing for you guys is that CryEngine is available for you to try out and give us feedback on the kinds of problems that you want to solve as well. So this is my message to you as well. Think about what stories, what experiences you want to tell. Imagine how you want people to experience them, whether they're as interactive games or linear experiences or as a classic movie. I believe that VR is the crossroads today. It's kind of the nexus where all of these different vectors are converging. And with the right tools, both of a creative and a technical nature, we will have the freedom to explore new realms of interactive transmedia entertainment in VR, AR, and beyond. And I look forward to seeing all of you there with me in the metaverse. Thanks.
Questions? Oh, you guys. Well,
So-
again, I'm sure Frank's going to hang out with us, so if you have any questions, please.
So I have some questions. I thought that was very clever of Simon. Where's Simon? I'm going to model some of my...
He's back there.
How many of you are working on linear projects? How many of you want to create an interactive experience where the user drives? And do you think you have ideas that could cross over that boundary? That's the question that I face. Somebody must have some ideas. This looks like a creative group.
I'm sure they're going to tell us over a beer later.
Awesome.
Well,
All right.
Thank you very much, Frank.
My pleasure.